Hey, remember when I said that I was going to do a PS2 game next?
I lied.
After all of these years, it finally happened. I have a CDI, and all of its glory. That means I get to talk about this!
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
My boy, this piece is what all true warriors strive for.
With the spread of the internet, the Zelda CDI games and the system in general quickly gained an extremely negative reputation and notoriety for being really fun to laugh at. Lord knows I've laughed at it as I watched YouTube poops religiously in middle school, and these were among the most prominent sources for those. However, sometimes easy to laugh at doesn't always mean bad. Zero Wing, for instance, got its name dragged through the mud for the English translation of the European Mega Drive release. People for a long time just assumed that it was a bad game based on that alone. However, not a lot of people actually bothered to play the game, and often the people who did claimed the contrary. That's the interesting thing about these games that are deemed fun to laugh at. A lot of the time, the narrative surrounding the game is dominated by people who never played it. And if people were too lazy to download a Genesis emulator and a ROM for Zero Wing before judging that game, you think that they're honestly going to find a way to play these before shitting all over them? These games haven't gotten any re-release, the CDI emulator is a joke, and it's especially hard to find a working CDI system these days, not to mention how expensive these things tend to be. Even then, you have to worry about the timekeeper battery and need to prepare to deal with that when the time comes. So do I think a lot of people have played these games? No. I think a lot of them watched a few videos from the Angry Reviewer days and just have parroted those points whenever the subject arises. Truth be told, I have had some fun with the CDI. Granted, a lot of that comes from the novelty of even owning something like this, but even something as infamous as Hotel Mario, I've got to be honest, I think this game's actually alright. It's no Mario World, but as kind of a follow-up to games like Donkey Kong and Mario Bros. Arcade, I think it's actually pretty decent. I'd rather play this over some of the blander Mario games from the early 2010s, that's for damn sure. However, can the same be said for Link the Faces of Evil? Now, some of you might be wondering why I'm only covering Faces of Evil and not Zelda the Wand of Gamelon. Well, the games are very similar, and I'll tell you the other reasons later after I talk about this game more. So with that, let's get started. Let's start with the presentation. The in-game sprite art is actually not too bad, and the backdrops are nice to look at. However, with that, we come across our first gameplay quirk. It becomes clear that the visual representation of the levels is not handled through tile sets, rather the levels are drawn out independently and collision is applied retroactively. They drew it out on paper and put it into 2D mode, if you will. The downside to this approach is that the visuals and collision don't always align as well as you would hope, and this game falls victim to that pretty heavily. Then you have the cutscenes.
Squadala, we are off!
They're hilarious. I'm not going to go into too much more detail because chances are you've seen them, but I will never get over how these characters move closer and farther away from the screen and the inconsistent proportions. It's nothing short of pure unadulterated animation magic. Ha! Then there's the music. I'm not gonna lie, I love this game's soundtrack. While a lot of the official Zelda games have had at least one song that I really get into, whether it be Deku Palace from Majora's Mask, Dragon Roost Island from Wind Waker, and so on, this game has a lot of songs that I really like. While it sounds absolutely nothing like a Zelda soundtrack, it's still awesome. This might be my favorite soundtrack in the series if it even counts. So what did the songs sound like? The Zelda series has always leaned more towards orchestral styled music. This game, kick-ass electronic music. I love it. As far as gameplay goes, the game is actually pretty interesting. You're presented with a large world map with multiple levels available to choose from. These levels are divided into smaller sections to accommodate the CDI's technical limitations. Often this will mean compact level design that has you crossing the width of the section repeatedly through different levels of elevation. The levels in general are pretty short, but it's not just about getting to the end despite that being the key focus. There's various interactive elements including NPCs, collectible items, and objectives to accomplish. It's kind of like you combine a standard platforming level with a hub world. Some of the levels also have unique resources like snowballs and fireballs that need to be harvested in order to take out enemies with the opposite trait. Use snowballs to kill fire enemies and so forth. By taking out bosses and reaching certain points in the level, you'll find Triforce scrolls on the walls, hit them with your sword, and new areas will be unlocked. The game is actually really unique in that regard, and while you get the gist of things pretty quickly, I found myself playing this game quite a bit just because it's something different, which would be great if this game didn't have some serious things working against it. For starters, there's the controls. A lot of people have complained about the button layout, well, with up being jump and button 2 serving as using items, entering doors, and pausing the game. However, in all honesty, I did not have too much of an issue with this. Maybe it's because I'm so used to playing games on the Commodore 64 and Amiga, where most games were designed around one-button joysticks, so these kind of funky combinations were pretty common. In Turrican 1 and 2, for instance, up is jump, button 1 fires, holding it down activates the surround beam, pressing button 2 or the spacebar will release a power line, or if you're crouching while pressing it, you'll enter the gyroscope mode. Given just how much I love those games, yeah, I can't say I'm against that sort of thing on principle, especially given the constraints presented by the CDI's controllers. While there are controllers akin to the Genesis and Gravis pads available for the CDI with 3 to 4 buttons, if you have deep pockets, both the remote and the spoon only have 2 buttons. The developers clearly wanted this game to be as accessible as possible, and to be fair, they do make the conditions for each command pretty clear, so that's not really my problem here. The problem is how the controls actually feel. To start, Link is a slow boy, and not just mentally. This was probably done to maximize the duration of time you're in an area, but doesn't help when you're being bombarded with fast enemies or bursts of hazardous projectiles. The slow horizontal speed also doesn't help with jumping over gaps because the slow speed significantly reduces how far you can jump. Platforming comes across as awkward because you just barely have enough range to make these jumps, and it also doesn't help that the jump controls are also pretty stiff. Link's jump height is fixed, and surprisingly pretty low for a game that's predominantly a platformer. This isn't like most 2D platformers where the longer you press the jump button, the higher you'll go. Hell, part of the reason as to why I don't mind up being jump in most Amiga platformers is that in those games you often have a lot of control over your jump. Here, you have very little control over it. You'll always be the same short hop that is just barely able to get across platforms, that is, if you can even tell where the platforms are due to the inconsistent collision mapping. There were also points where I was desperately trying to jump, pressing up over and over again, only for it to respond like an eighth of the time. And there were also points where I wasn't even pressing up, and I, for the life of me, could not get Link to stop jumping. However, the biggest problem with this game by far is the incongruence between the enemy design and the game mechanics. Let's review. Link can walk, jump, duck, walk while ducking, and slash at things with a sword. When standing perfectly still for a couple of seconds, he'll hold out his shield, which will deflect enemy attacks. At full health, he'll shoot out a tiny projectile from the sword. With the standard ground enemies, this isn't so much of an issue. However, the flying enemies can go die in a fire. They often spawn at the borders of the screen and slowly close in on you. Granted, games like Contra, Turrican, and Journey to Silius have this kind of enemy design. However, if you haven't noticed, those are platform shooters. As such, they give you mechanics to properly deal with this kind of enemy design. In Link: The Faces of Evil, you have this tiny little laser, and that's if you're at full health. Close quarters combat with these things is needlessly awkward, and you'll definitely take a hit if these things get close, and you cannot afford to take a hit. Once you do, your chances of survival drop faster than the Tower of Terror at Disney World. Casual play is not an option in this game. You have to play this game like you're attempting a no damage run of it.
Or else you will die.
While it's true that you have the snowballs and fireballs, they don't work on every enemy, and the bombs have deceptively little range as well, so your ability to complete a stage often hinders on not getting hit once, which isn't great when the game throws so much cheap shit at you. As mentioned earlier, Link has a shield and can attack what's in front of him. However, this game often throws enemies at you, some of which have projectile weapons on both sides of you. Ergo, you'll be able to take out one, but will often be hit by the other anyway, because there's no way to deal with both at once. However, after beating one of the bosses, you'll get a bell. What does this bell do? It freezes the flying enemies in place. This makes the game infinitely more playable. I used this thing left and right, until I couldn't. You see, this item drains rupees. I mean, I can understand why. The developers probably didn't want the player to break the game. However, the joke's on them because the flying enemies broke the game anyway. The Rupee Collecting is another thing that people often complain about, but it's yet another thing that I didn't have too much issue with. I often had hundreds of rupees at my disposal, and I wasn't even actively trying to collect them. My main focus was getting through these stages alive. I just picked up whatever rupees I could along the way, but yeah, because of mechanics like this, the game actually gets easier and easier as you progress. The hardest stuff in the whole game is near the beginning. So with that, I'm going to save and take a much needed break. Alright, I'm back. Time to load my save and... oh, poodle sticks. My saves are gone. Great! I'll grab my stuff! I get to do Tokyo Lighthouse again. Fuck Tokyo Lighthouse! This game has some legitimately cool stuff going for it, but just has so much going against it. Well, at least I'm getting farther along now, and game? Game, are you alright?
Hey, I think your game disc is dirty. Try ending the game and cleaning your disc.
I'll show you a dirty disc! This game is interestingly bad. On paper, there's a solid foundation for a good game. The formula is interesting, and once again, the music is awesome. But the game also has gigantic fundamental problems. The game is designed like a platform shooter, but the game's mechanics are too close to the original Zelda games for that to work. They either need to redesign the enemies to accommodate the mechanics better, or rework the mechanics to better suit the enemy design. Granted, the latter would probably eliminate any remaining connection to the Zelda games, but this game already had very little to do with them. This game is very frustrating, but perhaps due to its unique nature, I had a hard time putting the controller down. Despite getting the gist of things pretty quickly, I kinda wanted to see what the game would do next, and what music it might throw at me. As for why I didn't cover the Wand of Gamelon, I found it to be more frustrating than the Faces of Evil, and I just didn't feel the same drive to complete it. Faces of Evil at least had a few moments where I was like, oh, that's pretty neat. Wand of Gamelon just didn't have the same effect on me. If anything, it enraged me more. For me, this is one of those complicated relationship kind of games. It made me the angriest I've been at a game in a long time, but at the same time, I still had this kind of strange appreciation for it and enjoyed some of what it had to offer. I can't exactly call it a guilty pleasure, but at the same time, I can't say I completely hate it. This will just forever be a strange enigma that I can't quite make out.